I was thinking about that press conference that George W. Bush did about 13 years ago in Iraq. Remember, somebody threw a shoe at us?
Austria are mandating vaccines. From February the 1st, if you're in Austria, you've got to be vaccinated. Does that sound worrying? And have Austria got any historical lessons they could glance back at that gives them some guidance on how they should maybe behave in situations around mandating? Hello there, you 4 million wonders, you shimmering comets, you glorious starscape. Now, we're going to be talking about a serious issue, is vaccine mandates. Of course, I'll be careful to stay within the regulations of YouTube while discussing this and express no opinion on vaccines themselves or medical procedures. Simply, an open discussion will be taking place during this video, me doing most of the talking, the news participating to a point, where we discuss the idea of mandating lockdowns, the introduction of emergency powers, and try to some degree to place them in a historical context in a serious grown-up way, in spite of the cardigan. I also want to let you know, if you're in the UK, between January and May, I'm performing loads of dates. Some new ones are going to come available in Scotland too. Click on the link in the description, sign up to my mailing list, I'll give you details at the end. But now, let's understand what is going on in Austria.
On Saturday, protesters making their feelings known, not just about lockdown, but about the mandatory vaccinations plan for February.
These protests are happening all over the world. They're happening in the Netherlands, they're happening in the UK, they're happening in Australia. All over the world, a significant percentage of the population are concerned about vaccine mandates. I don't know if they're concerned about vaccines and the consequences of vaccines, or simply the mandates themselves. But let's be clear about something. We are facing an unprecedented situation, and I suppose we have to individually and collectively work out if the trade-off is a worthwhile one. Presumably, the argument for mandating vaccines and lockdowns is that the spread of coronavirus is so rampant and the consequences so dreadful that these measures, which some would consider draconian, have to be taken. And I suppose the protest suggests that there are a significant number of people that do not believe that to be the case. Perhaps they query the logic, perhaps they query the science. One area where I would be happy to nail my colours to the mast is every time you take away people's freedoms, you have to really be sure you're doing the right thing. And I would say a way that you would know that the right thing was being done is transparency around information, open discourse in public, no censorship. These would all be signs that what was happening was something that was open, fair and free. You could evaluate for yourself whether you think the criteria that I've just loosely listed are being met. Let's have a look a little more closely at what's going on there.
This massive crowd in Vienna objects to COVID restrictions being reintroduced.
I'm a free Austrian who wants to be free and live free in this country.
Liberté!
If you are a person who accepts authoritarianism, perhaps your perspective is this is a unique situation, authoritarianism is necessary, we need to yield to authority, then I suppose surely a caveat to that would be after a democratic process, after a public discourse. Otherwise, I suppose what we're saying is we don't want democracy anymore, not in regard to this issue, we want authoritarianism. And if that is your position, I suppose I respect your position, my concern would be that at some point that authoritarianism will find application elsewhere.
We know that the virus is there, but we leave it to people to decide whether or not to be vaccinated.
I came to give my opinion about freedom of expression and individual choice, and really to be able to respect everyone's choices.
I suppose my own reflective, speculative concerns are based on my observations of how power has behaved previously around, for example, the Cold War, terrorism, and less blatantly but still observably, potential biochemical warfare. If you watch Adam Curtis's documentary The Power of Nightmares, you can see how the threat of the Cold War was used to create a degree of social compliance during the 50s, 60s, 70s. and how the war against terror similarly was used to usher in new legislation. All of these things are pretty easy to observe. More latterly, biochemical warfare was used to tentatively explore areas of regulation. So the idea of a kind of war against germs or a war against COVID type mentality where non-compliance is seen as disruptive, for me is certainly cause for inquiry and question. Anything that seems like it's restricting human freedom without sufficient evidence that this is the only course, the best course, the necessary course, and that there is a consensus around that, would perhaps be cause for concern.
But even those who have taken the jab are sometimes suspicious.
When we're saying it's 95% effective at the beginning, we're seeing that's definitely not the case now. We're saying no more lockdowns, yet we're in lockdowns now. How can we really trust the information that's being given to us at the moment?
I'm vaccinated, but I did it just because we have this rule where we can only get into bars and restaurants and stuff with vaccination.
Perhaps democracy has always been somewhat vague and illusory. Perhaps many of the choices that we believe we are making are as a result of behavioural nudges that require us to behave in a certain way. Rats led down particular pathways in an all-pervading maze. But certainly this issue has brought to the forefront a good deal of resistance, and given the contributions of many of the people blessedly in this televised news footage, it's easy to see why there could be some concern.
Squarespace lets you run your brand like a business with e-commerce and more. So you can have longevity in today's world.
Want to sell online? Make sure you stand out. Go to Wix e-commerce and create a professional online store that will grab shoppers' attention. Build a state-of-the-art storefront and make it your own. Showcase your products with striking product pages and sell subscriptions. You can practically smell the beans. Go global and display prices in local currencies. Want to boost your sales? Grab a coffee and chat with your customers to offer product advice and send instant coupons. Streamline your checkout process with automated shipping fees and sales tax calculations. If a customer leaves items behind, remind them to complete their purchase with an abandoned cart recovery email. As orders come in, manage your inventory and track your sales from one convenient
had to go to the bathroom.
Comprehensive sales and traffic reports or build your...
Dr. Agnes Arnold Foster.
I had to use the bathroom, man. That took a minute. Alright, so I think I may share my stream with a Facebook art group. Good morning, guys. An albino deer? Wow. Damn. Alright, so what I want to do is, I may actually clean this palette off though. So yeah. I'm becoming less wasteful with paint, but that is definitely an ongoing challenge. Don't waste so much fucking paint, dude. Jesus Christ. Yeah, I'll take some coffee. Alright. Let's see if we can get this palette a little clean and just like the main area. I'm gonna keep these paints on here, but I am gonna add some reds and whites up here. So we're gonna be working in mostly pink. Nice pinks this for this session. And hopefully the next piece that I'm working on is dry enough for me to continue on it. So that's why I'll save these colors up here for what I'll be working on next. But I want this section kind of clean for what I'm going to do now. Alright. Alright. make sure I get all that thinner off of there. That thinner kind of dulls the paints down a little bit, so make sure your palette is free of thinner and try to get as much out of your brushes at the end of the day. Anyway, so now let's find our reference image. Alright, so this is the next piece I'm currently going to be working on. This is a commission for a friend of mine. It's their mother. So hopefully I'll be able to get to that this morning as well. But we'll see. We shall see, we shall see. Here is the next reference photo. This photo is actually done, so we're not using that anymore. And this photo is done. I absolutely love this image. And I sold it. I sold the original. Alright. So, we have our colors at hand. It's some Indian red, some Naphthol red, some flesh color, and some titanium white. I love flesh color. It's just so nice. But even better than flesh color, they actually have Caucasian skin tone. I can never just, I don't know. I never get over that shit, yo. I've been using that shit for years, and it's still just funny for me to even say that shit. Caucasian skin tone. Like white people, this what color you are. Like all white people are this color. It's so fucking weird, yeah. Alright, okay. Oh yeah. I wonder, technically, which one of these is darker. Alright. So technically Van Dyke Brown is darker than burnt and raw umber, but I still rather use the raw umber for this part. So this is probably going to be my darkest shade.
and Dr. Caitlin Gaiety are health historians working on Healthy Skepticism, a project that examines historical and contemporary medical skepticism. Australia has become the first European country to make vaccinations against COVID-19 mandatory. The proposal has been met with substantial opposition, partly fueled by the far-right Freedom Party. Over the weekend, 40,000 people protested in the streets of Austria, including many unaffiliated to the right-wing extremists. As a person that's attended many protests in my lifetime, I've always had more extreme contingents included within the broad, less politically specific component of the protest. I think it's inevitable that extremists from the left, the right, from all over the place will attend protest movements, because protest movements are one of the ways that change can come about. And just because there is a component of a protest that is far right, far left, far anything, that oughtn't delegitimise the entire movement, particularly if something is very well attended, as seems to be the case in these multinational protest movements, because by virtue of their ubiquity there is a good deal of concern. And sometimes I feel that the reporting on the extremist faction is a way of delegitimising the entire movement. Opposition has been framed in terms of medical ethics, bodily autonomy, and resistance to an overly interventionist state power. This is a politically risky decision. History reveals significant problems with compulsory vaccinations. Indeed, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that mandates increase hesitancy rather than reduce it. In 1853, the English government made smallpox vaccination compulsory. As in Austria today, this new policy was met with widespread protest. It kick-started a concerted and coordinated anti-vaccination movement that spread across the globe. The irony, there's no vaccine for the human spirit, baby. There were riots in several industrial English towns like Leicester, and new anti-vaccination leagues were established. These leagues published pamphlets and held rallies and communicated with kindred spirits abroad. The Anti-Vaccination Society of America was founded in 1879 following a visit by leading British anti-vaccinationist William Tebb. Compulsory vaccination was understood as a tool of an increasingly interventionist government, and many of the protesters were working class people who had been living under the brutalising regime of workhouses and the poor law. I suppose one of the things that sort of jars mentally is the idea, this is for your own good. We've got to do this for the good of everyone. It's not just for your health, it's for everyone's health. Where was this mentality when these people are starving to death on the street? Where was this mentality when people were losing their homes and houses? Where was this mentality with the quantitative easing of 2008? It's difficult to trust the ideas behind it, the stated ideals, because it jars with
shit that y'all think is good and worth fighting for. Everybody has to do it, but
you know those guys who always do what's best for you.
all the regular shit that goes on that doesn't affect you, you don't rally behind that shit.
No, hold on a minute, it says it's pharmaceutical companies. In 1898, the British Parliament passed an act to allow parents to opt out of the compulsory system, and the legislation was expanded in 1907. Since then, and in contrast to many other Western nations, Britain has avoided vaccine mandates entirely. Indeed, though, you can make a convincing case that Britain was the birthplace of the 19th century global anti-vaccination movement. In the 20th century, vaccines became unusually popular in the UK. This change was neither linear nor straightforward, but concerted campaigns on behalf of an increasingly respected, well-resourced and trusted welfare state and scientific community transformed controversial routine vaccinations into commonplace medical interventions. I suppose that's a good way of understanding how people react to coercion and mandating. If what you have is a state or a set of infrastructural agencies that are seen as benevolent because it's clear that their intention is service and help, for example, the National Health Service in our country, the United Kingdom, is generally regarded with a great deal of positivity, because whenever you go there, you see that everyone's really lovely and kind and trying their best. But if there is this sort of bureaucratic, technocratic push in league with corporations, it's not so easy to go, oh, well, this is clearly motivated by benevolence and altruism. We know them by their fruits. At this stage of the pandemic, Austria, along with other nations, has already vaccinated those who will do so voluntarily. We know from both historical data and more recent experience that at least some of those who remain are likely to have deep-seated suspicions of both public health systems and the state, often born of experiences of marginalisation and memories of abuse and exploitation. Vaccine mandates will do nothing to ameliorate these concerns. Indeed, they are more likely to exacerbate them. Ultimately, history cannot predict whether Austria's new vaccine mandate will succeed in achieving a higher national vaccination rate, but it does suggest that such mandates must be approached with great caution. Government compulsion does not always achieve increased vaccine uptake, and when it does, it can come at the expense of trust and social inclusion. There are no hard and fast rules here. Instead, what history does make clear is that the success or failure of vaccine mandates are deeply contingent and dependent on national context and the historical moments in which they take place. A lot to consider. What a fantastic article. And please, those of you watching this, remember that I have not at any point endorsed or denied vaccines. I have no opinion on what you should do for your personal health. I neither see myself as a necessary advocate for a government policy, nor a person who has to necessarily decry it. My job, I feel, is to participate with you, a person that I respect, on a level of equals, communicating about our individual and collective lives and the society.
Russell Brand told me not to get vaccinated. No, I didn't.
Suggested by that communication.
Russell Brand told me to go get vaccinated. No, I didn't.
To create community, and without it, we do
I'm
not
not
have
telling you do or
But
don't
that's
or
just what I
nothing.
think.
I'm reading
Let me know
just
what
what
you
I
think in the
think, yo.
comments below.
I'm
Do you
reading
think this is an
articles
important
and
moment
telling
for
you what I
Austria?
fucking
Do you think that
think,
this is the
yo.
possibility for a new global movement?
But that's crazy. You
What
gotta
lies behind it? Do you trust
say
your
that shit
government?
all
Do you
the
trust
time
the
not to
media?
get
Do you
fucking
trust big
canceled.
business? Let me know exactly what you feel. Give me a thumbs up. You won't give me a thumbs
Or
down.
every once in a
That's
while, I
what
always say I would never commit suicide. I love my life. I love being alive. I contemplated suicide, and I will never commit suicide. So if y'all find me somewhere with a suicide note, y'all know I ain't do that shit.
Also, sign up to my mailing list where I let you know exactly what I'm up to. And please, if you're in the
For
UK
the
or
record.
travelling to the UK, come see me live. I'm all over the place. There's a link in the description to see me on tour. Stay free.
I don't know. I told you and my mom my wishes for when I die. And I told my mama, if I die, I ain't kill myself.
Yeah, right. Fuck that. Oh, there was a
'Cause
suicide
like,
note.
this is
That's
the
really.
thing. I'm not even like, it's not even about suicide. I just couldn't even, I couldn't shoot myself. Like, I just couldn't. That's why I told her, like,
Well, they said Sandra Bland hanged herself, and Epstein hung himself. Like, did these people really commit suicide? Did Sandra Bland really
every time
commit?
Nick Ball kills somebody, they hang them.
Yeah, come on, man. Did she really commit suicide because she was going to be in jail for the weekend? Get the fuck out of
You
here.
don't need nothing, so please leave me alone.
So, like I say, if you find me and somebody say suicide, say,
Right.
How do you know? Because we got this shit on video of this nigga saying, I love my life, I would never commit suicide.
I mean, that
That's
doesn't
how we
mean
know.
anything, but yeah. Because people still, like, 4 years from now, you see much less happy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I feel you for saying that shit, because I done heard it enough that I know if I ever find you, somebody did that shit. Good thing you don't got no enemies.
I started doing that shit when I was making my music. I was talking too much shit about the government. Let me put a little safety net out there for myself just in case
Just
these
be like
motherfuckers.
asshole and say I'm gonna get assassinated by the government.
Exactly, like.
Because I was wondering why they ain't touch Absol, but I guess he's not mainstream enough. If he was on Kendrick's level, they probably would have killed him.
Can't tell these motherfuckers all this information. What I'm doing talking about pineal glands.
I might be tripping off that DMT. He struck me as a nigga that would do anything.
Now, the lawyer for William
Not anything, but you know what I mean?
and that's the man who filmed a portion of the shooting, says he's going to be filing a motion for a new trial in the coming weeks. That was expected. The judge, meanwhile, saying that sentencing could happen in a couple of weeks, but when you look at the severity of all these counts they were found guilty on, it's likely that all three men could spend the rest of their life in prison. Dagan?
Jeff, thank you so much for that. Greg, very often the media and the left insert race where there isn't, where it's not an issue, but here it was.
Yeah, I'm just glad that not all whites are racist.
Yeah,
Thank you, Reverend. Wonder how Tawana Brawley feels. All right, so humans do like to group things, especially when incidents happen close together. For me, you have the Rittenhouse case and you have the Arbery murders. These are close together, but it shows you that if you pick the right filter, which is the filter of self-defense, you would have easily predicted the outcomes of both cases.
Yeah.
If you had used a different filter, like race, you wouldn't have. But if you use self-defense, obviously Rittenhouse, clearly self-defense. Arbery, obviously, clearly murder. The prism of self-defense would have told you how that would have panned out. But if you just look at it through race, you would have seen the Rittenhouse case incorrectly. You would have been told erroneously that his victims were black. and that it didn't matter if they were white because those were white guys protecting black protesters. None of this is real. And you might have got the Arbery case correct, but that would have been probably by luck. The point is, you need to have more than one filter in life.
Why would it probably be by luck? Because white people are known for lynching black people? That's not a lucky guess. 3 white men, 1 dead black man. They probably lynched him. That's lucky. He is a lucky guess. Really? No,
we know that this is true, and it shows you how every case is different, every case is nuanced.
Historical
Avoid sweeping generalizations. Although my favorite take was from an organization, because right when a verdict happens, or the organizations will send out an email to you about. This is my favorite one. I won't say who this organization was. The verdict is a reminder of much-needed reforms in our nation's legal system. So I was thinking, but what if it came back as not guilty? They would have had the same response. So hence, their actual response is inherently meaningless. Right. You can use it.
Yeah, it worked. Why? That's how it's supposed to work.
In an incredible way, and it doesn't bring
what people?
back. But
the guy
the original
who used the book sessions for his girl.
Jackie Johnson on this case.
He was like, "Well, let me know. I would love to come see you." I'm like, "Okay, I'll check with my boyfriend and get back to you."
Took it over. Not only did she lose re-election, but she was brought up on charges by a
don't know y'all. You're not about to
jury
let y'all
related to her handling of it. Because again, what happened was, remember, because she passed. He was like, "Yeah, I'm not going to prosecute her," and then there was an outrage about that, and eventually you get to this result. One thing that's also interesting is that we're celebrating Thanksgiving tomorrow as a country, and we give thanks for our nation.
No, we're not celebrating as a country. Calm down. And with all these assumptions.
Sometimes
white
it's
people
slow,
are celebrating.
and it takes a long time. It's
Well,
a year and a half.
in fairness,
You know
black
what?
people
It
are.
works. And if you are somebody who says, well, it worked in one case and not in the other, in these cases, you can't actually do that. So I think that we have kind of a lot to be grateful for, and that the system works. And to that point, Jessica, after the verdict, you had a representative for the prosecutor and Ahmaud Arbery's family and everyone standing around her cheering the mention of law enforcement, cheering the mention of the prosecutors. And that's kind of refreshing and different.
Definitely. Well, that's always been the dichotomy versus what you hear about who likes law enforcement and who actually likes law enforcement. Like, the highest approval ratings for having more police on the streets come out of the communities that are most affected by crime. That's no surprise, and unfortunately in too many cities, that's black and brown communities that are living below poverty lines, etc. I think those moments are important. Hearing from Ahmaud Arbery's mother that her son is finally at peace and at rest.
How?
Something particularly moving.
Murdered. How is he at peace?
It was pretty quick as well. I know that everyone thought that this would come back last night. It seemed
The
pretty
semantics and the
conclusive. There were so
wordplay
many
is
counts. It
just.
was 9 counts, I think, for all of them to make sure that
This
the
nigga
jury
would have
got
been
through.
at
But
peace
this is a good
watching
day.
football
And
on Sunday,
it's a
eating
good
some
day,
fucking
like, when their
hoagies.
children
That's
was convicted is a good
at
day.
peace,
And
man.
also
Nigga.
that Kyle
Not in the
Rittenhouse
grave
went off
at
on a
25.
self-defense charge. And I hope that this starts a precedent of not having these riots for these things. Because that's really what you wake up thinking. Like, obviously, you want someone to go to jail if they have murdered someone, but you also fear for your city or country, wherever you are, that people are
Because
going
black
to
people are going to fucking burn it down if we don't give them what they want. And we fear that every time. Oh shit. Here's another lynching in the fucking media.
Just sit there and take in.
What are they gonna do if they don't get their way?
And be calm about it.
Right, and if you have the misfortune of living in a large liberal city, you have to sit back and watch people set your city afire and destroy businesses and then never even get charged with those crimes. You're from Georgia. How do you feel about this? Well, maybe not even feelings. Just what do you think?
No, listen, both of these cases had an element that is kind of new to the world, which is video evidence. And I think one thing I took away from both of these cases over the last 2 weeks.
No, it's not. That's how we know 9/11 was an inside job 21 years ago, because it was the first time in history where more than just, the super rich had access to immediate video footage. And so there was tons of news cameras, tons of cell phone footage. And that's how we know that shit didn't happen like y'all told us. So video footage for news is not new.
Comment on things that I thought I understood, but perhaps didn't because I wasn't there every day of the trial. And the same thing with this. These men, by all intents and purposes, and everything that was put out in the public for me to digest, down and killed him because they didn't like him in their neighborhood and thought they could. The one thing that's scary about both of these cases that I think really is what we need to address is we have this narrative, oh, we have this national institution against poor people or against black people. No, what we have small town courts and legal systems that can screw you over in a heartbeat. I mean, we had a prosecutor in Kenosha, Wisconsin that didn't want to release the true video of Kyle, the aerial footage. And then we had a prosecutor in small town Georgia that might not have wanted to try this case because of either the optics of racism or the fact that the neighbor was a retired cop. And neither one of those things should ever happen in this country. That's the one thing we shouldn't have to worry about.
I didn't know about that until like after the trial is over. That the district attorney was. This motherfucker called her immediately, like, "Yo, some shit just went down. I was a part of it." And she tried to have the case like tried somewhere else, or I don't know. I gotta look into that shit some more. But now this bitch in
And
trouble.
there's like these things, and then I think there's Jussie Smollett.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Watching that one.
But are they? I mean, A, are they televised? And B, to your point, Ghislaine doesn't have. There's no video.
Right.
Right. There's no video, so it's going to be one of those things where we won't really understand it, and where we may not see what we want to see.
Well, but there are a lot of victims
Hate
that are on
people
record
want to
and
get
are
their
already
butts
on
done
tape,
and they
so
don't
we
get it
will
done
have
right. So then when they shake your butt, it just don't move.
Are they televised?
Nice.
No, we can check.
I can't wait till we stop doing that to ourselves.
We should know this. Maxwell isn't. The voices in my head just pulled.
I know, she remember that lady who got silicone pumped into her butt and she died?
have the hairdo, so I guess that works out.
Yeah, like some backdoor surgery shit.
Young black
I don't think
lady.
it's right.
I don't think it is, but I don't want to venture it.
I know it's Gillette. It's
Elaine?
Yeah, keep going to these back alley surgeons and pumping that shit up with some industrial grade shit that's supposed to go in your house.
Catch our hottest interviews
Even
and
that,
most compelling analysis. You will
They
not
have
get
what?
it.
Gastric bypass, and then what's the other one? Well, whatever it is, when they give you that little sleeve, you have to lose weight, and you got to get that little sleeve, and then if you eat too much, it won't like literally burst your stomach, but it'll like burst your stomach. Like you can't overeat, and then you gotta keep up with it. Like nah, I don't know.
Is that what Aunt Jackie had gastric bypass?
Now if she needed it, absolutely, but like somebody who's younger. My grandmother got it and she needed it. She couldn't breathe. She was always sweating. But then, like I said, if you won't get it and just put the weight back on, what the hell is the point?
The College of Humanities, Marriott Library, ASU, the BYU Humanities Center, Exhibition, the Tanner Humanities Center, and the Department of English. So I really thank the sponsors that have gone out of their way to make this possible. I deeply appreciate that. I also want to thank Heidi Camp and Christina Bailey from the Humanities Dean's Office, College of Humanities Dean's Office, who saved me from all sorts of potential pitfalls in organizing this and everything else to make this work before. There will be a Q&A session after the Q&A session. So microphones will be going around. This is being live streamed. So please remember, everyone, again, don't start asking your question until you have people on the other side of the aisle who will identify you or identify yourself and put your microphone. So if you don't speak into the microphone, the live stream will be there. Okay? I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Graham Greenwald, who is the keynote for the events of Center Summit. A journalist, former constitutional lawyer, and the author of the best-selling books With Liberty and Justice for Some, How Would a Patriot Act, Great American Hypocrites, and a Tragic Legacy, Greenwald is best known now for his groundbreaking reporting for The Guardian on Edward Snowden's leaking of classified information about the surveillance and mass data collection activities of the National Security Agency, a topic that has fortuitously returned to public discussion with John Oliver's interview with Edward Snowden this past sundown on his show last week tonight. Greenwald's most recent book, No Place to Hide, builds upon his reporting for The Guardian, offering a gripping narrative that would fit very well in a spy novel. Greenwald tells of his initial contacts with Snowden, Their clandestine meetings, along with the filmmaker Laura Poitras and reporter Ewan McCaskill in Hong Kong in May of 2013. The book also provides the clearest account I've read of the web of NSA programs Snowden's information revealed, as well as a bracing and unapologetic critique of the idea that mass surveillance is every bit as safe from terrorism. Greenwald's meetings with Snowden are depicted in Poitras' recent film Citizen4, which won the 2013 Academy Award for Documentary Feature. I understand that the feature film based on these events and directed by Oliver Stone, now in production.
Definitely gotta get a microwave up there.
Greenwald has been the recipient of numerous honors,
We can
including the top investigative
bring that one over here.
from the Online
Put
News
this one
Association,
downstairs.
the SO Award for Excellence in
Oh, you
Reporting,
can go free.
You
You want something else?
A 2013 Pioneer Award from the Electronic Frontier Foundation,
Come on,
a 2013 George Polk Award for National
Did you know
Security.
you're gonna be crying? Let's go.
Foreign Policy magazine has named him one of the 100 most world thinkers. The Washington Post and Guardian jointly won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service on the strength of the reporting by Greenwald, Poitras, and McCaskill. In addition to his books and work for The Guardian, Greenwald has written for many newspapers and political magazines, including Salon, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, and The American Conservative. In 2014, he co-founded a new media outlet, Intersect, by means of which he has continued his essential reporting on national security issues, as well as other topics. His talk tonight is entitled Edward Snowden and the Secrets of the National Security State. I welcome Edward Williams.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thinking about that press conference that George W. Bush did about 13 years ago in Iraq. Remember, somebody threw a shoe at his head? He slipped it like Floyd Mayweather, right? He didn't flail, hand didn't come up, he just slipped it and was right back on prompter, man. That guy is slick. You throw a shoe at Joe Biden? You will kill him.
Here's someone,
horrible microphone.
who wants to be referred to as your truly. So.
Yeah, that's the pronouns they provided.
Some of your.
I was just asking if that was the pronouns they provided. But go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, it's no problem. I've seen your debates, Matt Dillahunty, and I keep hearing you say there's slavery in the Bible. I wonder how can you reconcile your position with these three verses, which seems to contradict your claims. First of all, Exodus 12:19 says that a stranger, from the Hebrew word ger, could
you can stop.
A congregation of Israel.
Here, look, I'm going to make this really easy. I'm going to mute you, and then I'll unmute you in a second. You said, how can I justify my position that there's slavery in the Bible? And then you were going to suggest verses that suggest there isn't slavery in the Bible. There is slavery in the Bible because, first of all, it talks about the Israelites being slaves in Egypt. So there's slavery in the Bible. But what I'm actually saying, despite the sloppy way you tried to phrase it, is that the Bible actually advocates for slavery, something that I've debated on numerous occasions. And if you go to Exodus 21, it specifically tells you who to enslave, how to enslave them, says that you can beat them as long as they don't die within a couple of days. And then continuing on in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it points out that they are your property and you can pass on to your children. There is not a single verse that says slavery is immoral or wrong. There are verses that can be interpreted that way, but you don't get to overrule a specific rule with a general rule that is interpretation. The fact that the Bible talks about slavery is not surprising. It's literally the word is in there in both Hebrew and in the Greek and Aramaic. The Bible advocates for slavery. I've done this debate till I'm blue in the face. There's literally nothing you can say that isn't going to make you look foolish. So what is it that you? Why is it that
Say
you?
it anyway.
Why is it that you disregard all of the verses that talk about who to enslave, how to enslave them, how much to pay, and how to treat them, in order to try to claim that the Bible doesn't support slavery? Why do you?
Twice warm coffee. I'm good on that.
Okay. How about I try again? So okay, so let's go against advocation of slavery. And
No. How about you try to answer the question that I just fucking asked you, or I'll hang up.
Do it. I just about to do
it. No, sir. You don't. No, sir. You don't get to do that. Shut up and listen, and then I'm going to let you talk. And if you don't do what you say you're going to do, I'm going to drop you like a bad habit. Why are you ignoring the verses that I have repeatedly pointed out that expressly tell you who to enslave, how to enslave them, how to trick Jews into being enslaved forever, that you can pass slaves on to your children, that you can beat them as long as
That's why when I called, I tried to just be nice and polite, say what I had to say really fast. And then sometimes you notice he will take 20 minutes or 15 minutes with a call. I think I could have had a 15-minute call with him, but
you guys hear me now?
It wouldn't have gotten anywhere, so that's why I just was like, I had this happen, this, but it was a bad girl. It was bad. I'm like, all right, man, peace. See you later.
Right, we don't argue with him. Like, I saw it, you saw it, like, hey.
What happened?
I hung up on
And that was my whole point, was that
So,
I can see how people believe in the supernatural. Do I, even after that experience, do I absolutely believe in like ghosts and goblins and demons and shit? No, I don't. I personally still don't. I know some weird shit fucking happened, and you tell me some weird shit, and it's like, okay, I can't explain this shit. I absolutely have no explanation. They doing what now?
The Bible is opposed to slavery, not even in the slightest.
I'm gonna call them because they never respond to it.
I really wish we could.
They might say,
I'm
oh, I
sorry
can drop it off.
that the real believers, the sincere believers, are absolutely terrified to call in. And I'm sorry that we can't get honest people to call in. Because I've had, for example, people want to say
I know you don't love them, babe,
when
but
Ray
their
Comfort called
prices
the
are
show,
so much better.
and I challenged him on slavery. And Ray Comfort not only acknowledged what the Bible said, but his response was that he doesn't believe everything in the Bible.
And they got
He
it
didn't say the Bible doesn't say that. He knows it says that. Every reasonable person knows what the Bible says about slavery. And then it becomes a debate about, well, does it advocate slavery? Does it endorse slavery? Does it permit slavery? Does it encourage slavery? It's all this fucking fine-tuning nitpicking when you dumb motherfuckers who are dishonest about your religion know absolutely that if slavery were in fact considered immoral by your God or the ancestors who think that they're speaking for fucking God, it would say, shall not own another fucking human being as property, period. It would be unambiguous. And the fact that it's not only doesn't say that, but says the exact fucking opposite is something that every one of you should be embarrassed about. You should point to your fucking holy book every day and say, God, please tell me what I can say to explain why this book is grossly fucking immoral, so that I don't have to call into the atheist experience and look like a fucking idiot denying what it literally says.
All right,
Jamal's giving me a chance to turn doing what I love into a full-time career.
You want to let them do your oil too, or no?
I need the oil change right now. I still got like 2,000-3,000 miles in there.
Teachable gave me the ability to scale my business outside of different social
I'll probably just get a full tune.
For as long as I can remember, I've been in.
That's nice. If you purchase a set of 4 Bridgestone tires, they'll give you $100 off instantly, and an extra $50 off when you use your card, plus $40 off a lifetime alone. They be giving hella deals. That's why I fuck with them. You use your credit card with them, you gonna save about $50 or $100 every time. You just gotta make sure you pay that shit off. I got my tires from them too.
Dr. Peters, thank you for being here.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
So let's get into trouble with the frivolous thought police right off of the bat. The book is subtitled An Antidote to Chaos. You describe order as masculine, the wise king at best, the tyrant at worst, and you describe chaos as feminine. These days, we're told that gender is socially constructed, a figment of our imagination. How deeply entrenched is sex? How far back do our categories of masculine and feminine go?
Well, they go back hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. And they do seem to form part of our fundamental...
Ha. See, he already got him confused because Knowles is a hardcore Bible God believer, and then as soon as Jordan Peterson talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, that already contradicts the fundamental beliefs of your religious structure, which is humans have not been here for hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, or nothing has been here that long.
Would you like to be a brand ambassador? Sure.
Okay, all you gotta do.
Right. What are the details? This one says we'll give you 3 pieces of jewelry if you collab with us. And I'm like, but how many do I have to buy? I didn't even read the message yet. No, they're like, Egypt, I'm so sorry to rush you, but this is a limited time. Blocked.
You need to do it now. Not now, but right now.
They have a deal on wiper blades. I don't need those. So do you think it's better to get the free brick check or the free wheel alignment check?
A wheel alignment, because you can see your brakes.
And my brakes sound pretty good.
You describe order as masculine, the wise king at best, the tyrant at worst, and you describe chaos as feminine. These days, we're told that gender is socially constructed, a figment of our imagination. How deeply entrenched is sex? How far back do our categories of masculine and feminine go?
Well, they go back hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. And they do seem to form part of our fundamental cognitive architecture. We tend to see the world in social cognitive categories. We tend to see the world as if it's an animated place. And the idea that sex is a large part of being animated is an extraordinarily deep biological, perceptual category. So it can't be dispensed with in any straightforward manner. It's part of the way that we view the world. Yeah, the idea that the way that we express ourselves sexually, say, let's call that gender, is malleable is obviously true to a certain degree, because human beings are extraordinarily malleable creatures. You can tell that just by looking at fashion variation. But that doesn't. Gender differences are all sociocultural constructs. In fact, the evidence that they're not, I would say, is crystal clear. The political types are about 30 years behind the social science, maybe 50 years behind it. That's why they're desperately turning to legislative means to enforce their idiot view of humanity on the rest of the world.
That is something I frequently notice about politics and culture, is the pop culture and the politics, they are always lagging several decades behind. So you'll see people espousing some relativistic or nihilistic view of the world, and you say, like, listen, man, I know you think you're sophisticated, but you're actually several decades behind. I want to talk about a dream that you write about in the book. You had a dream when writing Maps of Meaning, your first book, that you were hanging from a chandelier in a cathedral with tiny little people below, and you woke up in your bed, and you still saw cathedral doors. Close your eyes again, you're back in the center of the cathedral. Was that vision a sign from God? Or was it the fever dream of an academic who's been thinking too much? And is there a difference?
Well, I'm not sure there's a difference. I mean, it took me a long time to understand what the dream meant, but I eventually did. I mean, I knew at that point, or I had figured out as part of the process of interpreting that dream, let's say, that cathedrals were constructed in the shape of a cross. and so to be hanging at the center of the cross, which is essentially where the dream put me, was, well, obviously, that's something that can be read in terms of its fundamental religious significance, but that isn't the most appropriate level of analysis, I wouldn't say. The reason that cathedrals are constructed in the shape of a cross is because the cross is an X that marks the spot, so to speak. It's the center place of being, and we're each at the center place of being, and that's a place of suffering. And so, part of the Christian injunction is to voluntarily accept that and to thereby transcend it. And the dream was pointing out the inevitability of that, the fact that I was being driven towards that conclusion. See, I'd been spending years, I would say by that point, meditating and thinking about the fact of the Cold War and about this terrible ideological catastrophe that we had placed ourselves in the midst of. Partly ideological possession driving our proclivity to put the world at risk, and as an alternative to that, kind of a nihilistic hopelessness that involved no central narratives whatsoever. I suppose that would be the postmodern conundrum. And I was trying to see if there was a pathway between those extremes that was functional, and the dream was part of that process of realization. And the alternative to ideological possession and nihilistic hopelessness is something like the lifting up of individual responsibility as the proper mode of being, and that involves voluntary acceptance of suffering. And you're not going to act responsibly and forthrightly in the world if you're bitter and resentful because of the fact that your life is tragic and that things often go wrong. So you have to transcend that. And the dream was part of the process by which I was starting to understand that.
I do want to get back a little bit to that X marks the spot later, because we see it in the Christian tradition. We see traditionally the cross is represented with a skull at the bottom of it because it's Adam's skull, and Christ is the new Adam. I want to get back to that.
The idea there, that's an unbelievably profound idea. The idea there is that the first man, so to speak, the man who's laden with original sin and the knowledge of death is Adam, of course. And that what Christ represents is the antidote to what brought Adam down. And so Adam was brought down by knowledge of death and knowledge of good and evil, knowledge of mortality, knowledge of nakedness. All of that is what produced the fall. So that's an emergence into self-consciousness and the emergence of the tragedy of the self-conscious world. And then Christ is portrayed as an antidote to that. And the antidote is voluntary acceptance of that burden and simultaneous transcendence of it as a consequence of the voluntary adoption. And that's put forth in the Christian corpus as the imitation of Christ. So, which is a theme, of course, that runs through Catholicism and Protestantism and Orthodox Christianity alike. I don't think it's something that's attended to enough in the Western Christian traditions, which tend to emphasize our universal salvation through the sacrifice of Christ, which is, well, it has its utility in that it takes some of the moral responsibility off human beings, but it has its price too, because it does the same thing. It lessens the importance of what each of us do to some degree.
And the sobriety. Right, there is Christ tells us, take up your cross, but he also says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And it is true, certain traditions fall a little bit too much to one side or to the other, and they don't hold that tension that you see in your dream, that it clearly pervades the book.
Well, that idea too of the burden being light, that's a very interesting one, because it's a very great paradox. But one of the things that's quite interesting about attempting to only say things that you believe to be true, and then also to acting in a manner commensurate with that, is that it does make things lighter, because you're much less likely to be burdened by your past. You're not guilty and afraid that the terrible things that you've done are going to come to light, and you're not sleeping uneasily on a bed of nails that's your guilty conscience. And so there's a lightness about it, and a lightness about accepting things, even though it's a very dark act in some sense to accept things. There's a lightness that comes along with it. It's the lightness of being all in, I would say, something like that.
And the opposite of that, when one doesn't have that, the culture is so burdened by itself, it begins to hate itself. You write quote, "Now also another problem has arisen, which was perhaps less common in our harsher past. It is easy to believe that people are arrogant and egotistical and always looking out for themselves. The cynicism that makes that opinion a universal truism is widespread and fashionable, but such an orientation to the world is not at all characteristic of many people. They have the opposite problem. They shoulder intolerable burdens of self-disgust, self-contempt, shame, and self-consciousness. Why in 2018 do we so hate ourselves?"
Well, I think that paragraph does lay out a lot of it, but we've added additional sources of guilt to that are, I think, part of the modern, what you call, manifestation of the idea that human beings have original sin and are fallen creatures. Like, we blame ourselves en masse for the depredations that the planet suffers at our hands, and let's say, without any commensurate sympathy for ourselves. I mean, there are a lot of us, you know, we're going to hit 9 billion by midway through this century, and then it looks like things will probably level out. But that's a lot of people, and we're putting a very heavy load on planetary resources, let's say, and out-competing a lot of animals. And, well, you know the whole environmental catastrophe story. You bloody well hear that all the time. But, you know, mostly what we're trying to survive with a relative minimum of excess misery. And we're trying to do that the best way we can see fit. It's only been since the 1960s that we've started to recognize ourselves as a force of planetary significance.
Right.
You know, 100 years ago, we believed the oceans were inexhaustible. That was a conclusion that was drawn by a commission that was set up by the British Parliament. And so it's only been, not even in my lifetime, you know, I'm older than the idea that we are a planetary shaping force, but we carry terrible guilt about the price we have to pay for existence, you know, and you hear people say things like, well, the planet would be better off without us, which is like an absolutely horrifying thing to say. But I can understand why people say it, even though I think it's a dreadful thing to say. But it's never said with any sympathy. Like, we're fighting against mortality itself, and all the suffering that goes along with that. It's not surprising that we don't do it perfectly. It's a virtually impossible load. And so if you add that existential load as the member of a species, say, with the kind of power we have, to the knowledge that each person has of their own inadequacy and failings, then, you know, we carry a heavy existential burden for something that was very well developed by the existential psychologists in the 1950s. And people feel guilty and ashamed about being, just about being human. And then they don't treat themselves very well. Mm-hmm. And that's not helpful. It's not a solution to the problem.
It isn't even anti-American or anti-Western. It is anti-human fundamentally. And you quote the Columbine shooter in the book, who wrote, "Nothing means anything anymore." And one aspect I really enjoy about this book is the constant weaving together of different disciplines, of a university, of philosophy and psychology. Everybody and her mother is on depression drugs these days, and yet I suspect a great deal of apparently psychological problems are really essentially philosophical problems. This pervasive cultural nihilism that robs people of meaning, of a sense of meaning. What portion of our social malaise do you think is philosophical, and how did we get here?
Oh, I think it's deeper than that even. It might be theological. Like, I think the culture war that we're in is essentially a theological war.
I agree.
It's a war on the very idea of the transcendent individual. And some of that can be conceptualized psychologically, but that's not the deepest possible level of conceptualization. I mean, our culture is predicated on the idea that each human being, this is the source of the idea of natural right, let's say, or of individual sovereignty. There's an idea that each person is touched by divinity, let's say, and is made in an image of God. That actually means something in the context of the story within which it's to be interpreted. So the Word of God, which was active at the beginning of time in the Judeo-Christian account of creation, used truthful language to extract habitable order from chaos. And I think that is what human beings do. I don't think we've ever formulated a more accurate representation of the nature of human consciousness, because we confront potential. We call that the future. We confront an infinite landscape of potential. and we choose how we're going to make it manifest itself in concrete reality. Like, that is really what our consciousness seems to do. And that brings new being into being. And our legal systems are predicated on the idea that that capacity should be given all due respect, right, as the generator and recreator of culture itself. And like, you can't just throw away that idea. It's the idea on which our society rests. And the postmodern neo-Marxist types are after that idea, hammer and tongs. They hate everything about it. And so that's why I think it's a theological battle. That's why Derrida said, you know, he called Western culture phallogocentric. Phallo, P-H-A-L-L-O. And he meant male-dominated and logos-centered, which is, well, it's certainly logos-centered. Is he going to criticize that? Well, yeah, I'm going to criticize the idea of the sovereign individual, and that's certainly what the postmodern types do.
Didn't Derrida say
upon them, I would say?
Didn't he say there's nothing outside of the text, or it's all, everything is relative, everything is a matter of interpretation?
Yeah, well, he disputed whether or not he really said that, but I think that it's a pretty accurate. Well, right, and I think it's a pretty accurate summation of the postmodern ethos. They're skeptical of meta-narratives, of transcendent narratives. Well, that's all well and good, except that, like, if you and I make an agreement so that we can live together peacefully and cooperate and compete over the long run, it's because we've established a narrative that transcends both our individual identities. And if we're going to live together as a culture, that means that despite our individual and cultural differences, let's say, and let's say we can maintain as many of them as possible, we need to subordinate ourselves to a transcendent narrative that actually constitutes the framework for peace and cooperation, and for civilized competition. There's no let's dispense with the meta-narrative. It's like that means let's dispense with that which unites us. Well, then all we have is fragments, and then we're going to fight, because human beings tend to fragment towards their tribes and then fight.
Right.
And that's what I see happening both on the left. The left is pushing it, I would say, with everything they've got. And the radical right is responding in kind. It's really not good.
MyPillow wants to give back to our listeners. You can get great discounts on all MyPillow products if you go to MyPillow.com right now and click on the radio listeners specials. I love MyPillow. It's a great conservative, patriotic company, so we all kind of like them because of their politics. But I tell you, they could be run by the Taliban right now, and I'd still probably buy their products. They're that good.
Right.
Okay? They're that good. The pillows, the mattress toppers, the towels, so much more. They've also got a buy one, get one free offer on the Giza sheets. These are top quality sheets. You're going to love them. They have a 60-day money-back guarantee with a 10-year warranty. But you're not going to need that warranty or the money-back guarantee because you're going to love them so much. So head on over there right now. Check out the buy one, get one free offer on the Giza sheets. Use promo code DailyWire at checkout or call 800-651-1148. You'll also get deep discounts on all MyPillow products, including the pillows, the slippers, the MyPillow mattress topper, MyPillow towel sets, and so much more. 1-800-651-1148. Tell them Daily Wire sent you. 1-800-651-1148. These deals will not last forever, so call now. I love this central theme of the book of culture as a natural fact of the world, because in our highly scientific age, many people seem to think, or take it as a given, that we just perceive the bare world, the valueless facts of the world without any meaning, and then we ascribe later meaning to those things. You write in the book, quote, there is a little more natural than culture, that we perceive...
Yeah, well, I mean...
my question on this is, what does that say about how we should live?
Well, one of the things it says is that you can't exist outside of a framework of value. It's not possible. It's not technically possible. I outline this in quite a bit of detail in Chapter 10, which is called Rule 10, which is called Be Precise in Your Speech, is that the way the world manifests itself to you is integrally tied to your value structure. And that's because, to put it very simply, is that your very vision is dependent on an aim. Like whenever you look at the world, you're aiming at something. You're aiming at something with your eyes. You can't focus on something without aiming at it, and you won't aim at it without valuing it. So your very perceptions are dependent on your value structure. Now that doesn't mean there isn't a world. It means that, it does mean that experience is a complex interplay of your value structure and the unmanifest world. It's something like that. And then that begs the question, which is, well, if you have to have a value structure, then what should it be? Well, and then that brings us back to the ideas that we were talking about earlier. Like, you should value being. You should take on the responsibility of being as your highest ethical obligation and try to improve it, try to reduce suffering, try to make the most out of yourself in a way that's beneficial to you and your family and your community. You should aim high.
I do.
And your perceptions will reconfigure themselves around those aims, and that will allow the world to manifest itself to you in the most positive possible manner, or at least in the most meaningful possible manner. And in the absence of that, all you have is stupid suffering. That is the anxiety and depression that we talked about earlier. Without a point, without value, without an aim, all you're left with is the misery and anxiety of life. That makes people bitter.
I love to bring up the notion of the aim, because one can react to this stupid suffering in a number of ways, but this is so clear. You write in it, you say, you cannot aim yourself at anything if you are completely undisciplined and untutored. You will not know what to target, you won't fly straight, even if you do get your aim right. And then you will conclude there is nothing to aim for, and then you will be lost. And these days, the prevailing moral framework, as I see it, is if it feels good, do it. How is it that discipline and the straight and narrow offer the best chance for a good life? And how is it that we have forgotten that is the case?
Well, the reason that discipline is necessary is because you're in mass of competing short-term interests. And so the question is then, well, which short-term interest should win out? And the answer to that is, well, none of them. They need to be organized into a hierarchy that makes them functional across time and across individuals. So like a 2-year-old is very likely to act out his or her proximal impulse. But of course, a 2-year-old can't survive in the world. You have to bring your primary instincts, let's say, under the regulatory structure of a higher order value system that allows them to manifest themselves without undue mutual sacrifice across large spans of time in the presence of large numbers of other people. So that requires a very sophisticated ordering. It's like, we already talked about the fact that a meta-narrative is necessary to unite subcultures, say, so that they can operate peacefully and harmoniously within the same space. The same thing applies within you, because you're an internal coalition of warring, single-minded tribes, and they have to all be brought under the organizational structure of long-term collective vision, let's say. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, you have to be disciplined. And any discipline, technically speaking, is an attempt to bring all those competing short-term impulses under a larger scale and more inclusive framework. And so you do that, and then, well, that's actually what gives you freedom. Being impulsive and being free aren't the same things, because if you're impulsive, you're just the slave of your impulses.
Right.
There's no freedom in that. That's the same freedom, so to speak, literally, that a 2-year-old has, because a 2-year-old isn't socialized yet. So it's a completely, that doesn't function in the sophisticated world. It doesn't work.
Right.
Everyone knows it.
We just like to pretend sometimes. We say, oh, that does feel good, you know. Now, I have one last...
Well, we like to pretend all the time, because that's why we go out and drink, you know, because drinking enables you to blind yourself to the long-term consequences of your actions. And there's no doubt that that's very, very rewarding in the short term, but it's also why you wake up the next morning hungover and ashamed.
I must tell you, Dr. Peterson, we celebrated St. Patrick's Day and my birthday on this Saturday, and I can attest with real-world experience to your theoretical notions. I have one last question that I want to ask you. You call for people to consider meaning as the higher good. You write, consider then that the alleviation of unnecessary pain and suffering is a good. Later in the book, you call Satan and our image of hell a dreamlike fantasy. Later still, you say that hell is metaphysically true. In the final chapters, you write a very moving, what seems to be series of prayers to, quote, the source of all revelatory thought, in a discussion with God. My question, which is it? I'm not asking about metaphor or symbol and symbolized or signifier and signified. Is God fact or fantasy?
Maybe God's both.
But if you had to pick one, I don't mean to be glib about it.
Well, no, I don't think you can do that in a discussion like this, because
I'm agnostic.
you're talking about matters where the distinction between those things actually starts to blur. No, because there's a reality, for example, there's a reality to fantasy that we don't really understand. Fantasy is how new things come into being. And fantasy has a structure, it has this archetypal structure. And so, let's see if I can come up with a better. I can't come up with an answer to that that's so blunt, because look, one of the things I mentioned while we were having this discussion was that our legal system is predicated on the idea that each individual is made in the image of God, and that there's actually a reason for that it's tied into the Judeo-Christian narrative. And the narrative suggests that the way that you bring habitable order, the habitable order that is good, into being, so that's what happens in Genesis at the beginning of time, is by using truthful speech, and that there's something divine about that. It's like, as far as I'm concerned, that's a fantasy, but it's also factually true. It's a place where the metaphor and the literal unite.
But is there a distinction to be made here between metaphor, metaphysical reality, and some sort of fantasy? You know, in the sense that a unicorn would be
Michael is so devoutly religious. He just wants to know it, bro. Are you on my team? Do you believe in God or not?
Truth, metaphysical
both.
Reality,
you know.
But
well, I think there are some forms of fantasy that
philosophically speaking, yeah, I believe in a God.
They don't have the real counterpart, but there are some places where fantasy and reality meet, and we don't understand those places very well. Now, I don't understand them very well. I think part of the reason that I have a hard time answering questions like that is because they transcend the limits of my knowledge.
Because he talks about the metaphysics and spirituality, but he's not really religious.
It is the case, as far as I can tell, that the central
That's
presumption
why I don't mind listening to him on
is
a lot
that
of
each
different
person
topics.
has within them a spark of divinity, and that spark of divinity manifests itself in the bringing into being of the present from the potential of the future. I think that's all true. Is that a fact? Like, is that the sort of truth that we would call a fact?
I think so.
It isn't. Well, possibly, but it's not the sort of fact that you discover that it doesn't sit easily in the category of facts that scientists have produced.
Right.
It's more like an inference. So let's say you observe a bunch of people acting a particular way, and then you say, well, here's the rule that describes their action. Say, well, does that rule represent? What does that rule represent? Does that represent a reality? Well, it represents a reality of sorts, but it isn't the same sort of reality that's represented by a pure scientific discovery. They're not in the same category. So I'm not exactly sure what... Look, here's the observation. If people treat one another as if they're touched by divinity, their personal lives improve, their familial lives improve, their social structures stabilize, they produce functional political systems and productive economies. Does that make that proposition true? Well, possibly, but it doesn't make the proposition a fact in the same way that scientific investigation makes a scientific fact true.
Of course. I asked the question in this. I asked the question in this way because I think you write with heartbreaking beauty about Christianity, about the metaphysical logos that is made flesh and dwells among us. And watching you write about this in the book is hugely edifying. So we talk about theological issues a lot on the show. I highly recommend that everybody goes out and reads 12 Rules for Life. And also, I press the question that way because my bishop promised me a toaster if I could baptize you. But then we might have to save that for another program. Dr. Peterson, thank you so much for being here. It has been a wonderful conversation. I will finally allow you to go on and move on with, I'm sure, your very busy rest of your day.
And that's what he was hoping on so hard, like, watch, I can get my audience to see me fucking get this guy to confess of his own mouth he believes in God. Nope. I kind of do, but I kind of don't. I see the benefits, but then, like, it's still not scientifically testable. Like, we don't know.
You know what's better than a $5,000 PC? A $5,000 PC that costs $0. It's time to give you free stuff thanks to our friends at Honey. That's right, you can win a $5,000 computer just by adding Honey to your browser right now at joinhoney.com/Linus giveaway. And it's the gift that keeps on giving, because when you're shopping online, Honey automatically searches millions of
First and foremost, the manga is different than the movie due to the movie coming out before the manga was finished. The following explanation will allude to the 1988 film Akira. Let's take a second to explain the backstory of Akira, as his story is essential to understand the ending of the film. Akira a Boy was a young boy originally recruited by the government for studies related to that of parapsychology. Parapsychology is a field of study concerned with the investigation of paranormal and psychic phenomena, which include telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, and other paranormal claims. The government project forced Akira to develop powerful psychic abilities. These abilities eventually grew beyond young Akira's control, and on July 16, 1988, he destroyed Old Tokyo in a violent explosion. An explosion the rest of the world mistook for a nuclear detonation. This situational misinterpretation led to a chain of events that grew to what would be known as World War III. After the explosion, Akira was retrieved by scientists. These scientists dissected the boy in hopes of discovering the cause of his sudden psychic growth, but were unable to come to any conclusions. This is why his remains were sealed and cryogenically frozen. The existence of Akira and the aftermath of the original project became an ongoing problem within the upper reaches of Japan's political members. One can only assume that it would be incredibly difficult to hide Akira's almost divine power. This is the reason that the Japanese government worked so hard to keep Akira as one of the most highly guarded state secrets. However, leaks of information allowed Akira to become a messianic figure among cults throughout Neo-Tokyo. Minister Nezu, a corrupt politician, views the power of Akira to be an opportunity to gain further political power, which is why he manipulates a dissident group known as the Resistance, into freeing the child espers in an attempt to further his own ends. To further explain why Akira is seen as a god, and explain why Tetsuo is mistaken for Akira by the cultists near the end of the film, we must first explore the beginning of the end of the film. The beginning of the end first begins during the altercation between Tetsuo and a member of the clown gang. This encounter leads Tetsuo's direct contact with Takashi, one of the 3 child espers. This contact is the catalyst that triggers the awakening of his latent psychic abilities that spark the interest of government scientists and officials who immediately abduct and subjugate Tetsuo to a variety of tests and experiments. During this time, a scene can be found within the film where Dr. Onishi imposes Tetsuo's psychic pattern over that of Akira's. From this scene, it is important to note 2 things. Tetsuo's pattern is almost an exact match for that of Akira's, and the only difference between the two is that Tetsuo's pattern is the inverse of Akira's pattern, or the opposite of Akira's power. In my personal opinion, the inverse correlation between Akira and Tetsuo's power is explained by the child esper Kyoko. This can be found within the confines of the following line. Big people like you shouldn't have these powers. You see, Takashi, Kyoko, and Masaru are all in fear of Tetsuo, not because of his power, but because of the selfish and adult-like way he wields it. A deeper explanation of Kyoko's aforementioned line and the reasoning behind these sects of people viewing Akira as a god can be found in a conversation that takes place between Kai and Kaneda. Unfortunately, the quote can be hard to understand. Even Kaneda fails to correctly interpret the meaning behind the following lines. What if there were some mistake, and the progression went wrong, and something like an amoeba were given the power like a human's? Amoebas don't build their own houses and bridges, do they? They just devour all the food around them. From this brief and semi-informative conversation, we can come to some pretty powerful conclusions. If an amoeba or any type of simple bacteria were to gain the power of a man, this bacteria would then appear as a god to its own kind. If the power of a human were to be explained to an amoeba, it would not do as humans do, it would merely harness this new power to better do what an amoeba already does, consume and destroy. Basically, what Kay is saying is as follows. If you give the power of a god to a human, they will continue to act upon their set-in desires, which alludes to the reason that espers agree that big people shouldn't have these powers, as big people are impure and are already devoted to their ways, unlike with the purity of mind found in a child. Akira and Tetsuo can harness a power of much higher magnitude than the average human. This power is the reason cults revere Akira as a god and mistake Tetsuo's sudden appearance for what they perceive to be Akira's much overdue second coming, one that will once more usher in a new world era. Speaking of Tetsuo's sudden appearance, it is time to dive into the last portion of the film, beginning with Tetsuo's rampage. This destructive rampage can be found near the end of the film and is brought about by his lust for power. Once aware of his existence, the existence of Akira, Tetsuo becomes convinced that he can supplement his desires and control his new abilities only through finding Akira. This violent search only seems to feed into Tetsuo's self-delusions and as a consequence leads to the death of countless innocent bystanders.
With Squarespace, editing and adding pieces on my e-commerce site is quick and easy, so I can focus more on the creative part of my business.
Oh my god, this shirt is taking way longer than I thought it would.
Pick off your gift list early during Kohl's Black Friday Super Deals. Earn $15 Kohl's cash for every $50 spent. Take an extra $10 off your home purchase of $50 or more, plus an extra 15% off. Get Sharper Image earbuds for $19.99. 50% off games and puzzles. Women's denim, $12.74. 40% off Champion. And 50% off toys, including hoverboards, scooters, and Power Wheels. Shop Black Friday Super Deals. Thursday and Friday only.
After the aforementioned rampage, Tetsuo is being carried by Kaori within the confines of the Olympic Stadium. During this scene, Kaori asks Tetsuo to explain why everyone is calling him Akira, to which he responds, he never existed in the first place. This shows that Tetsuo has definitively given up on his search for Akira, concluding that he never existed. However, the child espers know the truth. Not only do they have full knowledge of Akira's existence, they know Tetsuo is about to bring upon the return of Akira. During this instance, Tetsuo begins to lose control of his powers. This is illustrated during the point where Kaori points out his metal arm, an arm that begins to cause Tetsuo great pain, as its wires expand like sentient vines through the concrete of the stadium. This is when Tetsuo first becomes afraid of his own power. He demands the one thing he loves away from him, telling Kaori to get away out of fear that he might accidentally harm her. Shortly after this, Tetsuo is shot by Colonel Shikishima in the arm. Since Tetsuo's power is no longer inhibited by the drugs, he is unable to contain his power and loses control. Now this is where things really begin to heat up. Tetsuo begins to transform into a massive blob comprised of writhing assorted parts that originate from the wound on his arm. This transformation begins from Tetsuo's arm because he is acting as a sort of cage containing his power, and when his power springs out of control, it does so by bursting through his weakest point. This is where Tetsuo completely loses control. He envelops Kaori in his mass and inadvertently crushes her. Tetsuo begins to cry out for help, helpless against his own power. Afraid and alone, he takes the form of a baby. It is then that Akira appears and engulfs Tetsuo and Kaneda in an orb of light. During this time, Kaneda rushes into the light, attempting to save his friend, despite the warnings from the children. After Kaneda enters the sphere, the Esper children begin to converse, stating that none of this is Kaneda's fault. They decide to go into the sphere of light in an attempt to save him, even though they know that once they are inside, they will never be able to return. Before Kaneda is telepathically warped out of the sphere of light, he notices that Tetsuo's memories can be seen along with glimpses of Akira. The Esper children then assure Kaneda that Akira will take care of Tetsuo, as his arrival allowed Tetsuo to come to terms with himself, allowed him to understand his power and the components of himself that he originally did not understand. During this, Kyoko says, "Because one day we ought to be able to," exclaiming that it might be possible for the Espers to eventually return to their original universe, while Masaru states, "Because it has already begun." He is explaining that the creation of a new universe is already underway. Let's allude back to the scene where Kai is imprisoned with Kaneda. During this time, she is being controlled by the child Esper Kyoko. Speaking through Kai, Kyoko explains that all knowledge in the universe comes from a single ultimate beginning, a beginning that is the result of an ultimate consciousness. The reason it is important to revisit the previously mentioned conversation is due to the fact that it explains where Tetsuo goes at the end of the film. The orb of light Akira created was in fact a pocket universe intended to contain the explosion that resulted from Tetsuo gaining his ultimate consciousness and transformation into a new universe, just as Akira did in the beginning of the film. You see, a universe consists of two components, space and time. Akira created his pocket universe by borrowing space from our universe. When his pocket universe disappears, it is because Tetsuo's universal time axis was established, and his universe as a whole separated from our own. This is why Dr. Onishi sees a new Big Bang and asks, is this the birth of a new universe? After the new universe's departure, the space that was borrowed is returned and buildings begin to rain from the sky. This is where the final line of the movie can be heard. I am Tetsuo. This Old Testament style I am alludes to the fact that he has ascertained godlike power and understands how to use it. It is also important to note that Akira is a narration and debate regarding the morality of developing nuclear weapons and the corruption involved in wielding such a power. Let me know if you would be interested in a video explaining the effect of the atom bomb on anime as a whole.
There is a rumor that you have taken Russia from your husband.
What are you two doing? You know why we want the coup. You don't care for the people. She aspires.
Did you do this?
Today, I'm going to be making homemade gifts for my friends and surprising them. Michael said everything I needed, and it was actually so simple. I can't wait to surprise my friends with these. Look at it! Shop now at michaels.com.
We've all heard of cyberpunk, but what is cyberpunk? A casual explanation might end up in a ramble about cyborgs, laser guns, neon lights, and rainy city nights. But behind that facade of neon and chrome lies a cultural movement. It masks the seedy underbelly of crime, corruption, corporate authoritarianism, and the dangers of rampant technological progress. Skyscrapers extend as far as the eye can see, and for every brightly lit ramen shop or tech emporium offering the latest and bleeding-edge gadgets, you're just as likely to find yourself in a dingy alley, surrounded by poverty and addiction. The overabundance of technological wonders and indulgences punctuate the decrepit slums of the megacities and sprawling metropolises of a dystopian future, which encapsulates cyberpunk's most fundamental definition: high-tech, low-life. It's easy to see why these themes are so popular. It seems like every day we take a step closer to the future we saw on television. Robotic arms, self-driving cars, smart homes, killer drones, and an economy driven by our unquenchable thirst for the newest, sleekest machine. These themes are prevalent in all forms of art, from novels to film, from television to video games. And in this documentary series, we'll explore the decades-long history of the genre, its origins, its many influences, and how these ideas inspired neo-futurism, both in entertainment and many of the technologies we use today. So let's jack into one of the most fascinating movements in recent history, cyberpunk.
Got a good bit done. Take a little break. Come back, I work on these headphones and those books. Get with y'all later.